What's up YouTube, this is Red Devilosa from Red Devilosa Reviews. Before I get started with this video, I'd like to take the time and thank every one of you for helping to get my channel over 800 subscribers at the time of this recording. Like the topic of the show, I'm nearing my quest to get to 1K subs. And if you're interested in movies, comics, TV shows, and video games, subscribe to the channel for more of that content. Percy Jackson received its newest adaptation based on the beloved novel series created by Rick Riordan. The first season adapted the first book, The Lightning Thief, after a poorly received version of the first movie in 2010. I've talked about this with my good friend Unity on our podcast, Another Reviews Core podcast, which I will link in the description down below if you'd like to check it out. Also, a shameless plug, but our podcast could really use the attention, so if you could subscribe to that for more discussions on media analysis, that would be most appreciated. I wanted to give you my final thoughts on the show for my channel because, let's face it, Patrick, I need content.
I can live with that.
I wanted this video on my channel because I am passionate about the Percy Jackson franchise. I'm assuming you do, viewer, know what Percy Jackson is about. A troubled kid who learns that he is a demigod's son of Poseidon, who gets attacked by monsters, makes friends with a satyr, Grover Underwood, and daughter of Athena, Annabeth Chase. The three of them go on a quest to recover the Master Bolt from the underworld before the summer solstice, otherwise a war of the gods would happen. During the quest, the three heroes go through many monsters, trials, and traps before being successful by the end, with an impending doom lurking for what's to come. More could be said, but that's the gist. I loved the Percy Jackson novels growing up, and while I wouldn't say I liked the movie adaptation from 2010, there is something nostalgic about that film, despite how poor it was as a film and as an adaptation of The Lightning Thief. It's gold compared to Sea of Monsters, but that's a discussion for another day. Percy Jackson would not return to the screen until 2023-2024, this time as an 8-episode series on Disney+. Rick said he would be more involved in the show's production, which brought much positive feedback from book readers, but I was cautiously optimistic. There could be pros and cons for an author of the book having direct involvement in the show, especially when you consider this is the second time it's going to have an adaptation, where the first one had Rick sending documents worth of emails in detail about what was wrong with the first film and suggestions on how to save it. With this new attempt, an author can help you faithfully go through the book and even keep some of the little details, like Annabeth giving her necklace to Percy for good luck that also contained her father's class ring in it, and Sally making blue pancakes because Percy loved to eat blue-colored food. However, sometimes this could be an opportunity for the author to make a second draft of their book from long ago to make changes for the silver screen, or they forgot to re-establish some of the stuff that previous fans would have known, but not for the television audience that didn't read the book. I'm not gonna lie, I just couldn't get myself to enjoy this show, but I don't think the show is irredeemable by any means. I do this because I believe this franchise deserved better, and I wish it were better than it is so far. We know the second season has been approved, so there's room for improvement from this season that we should talk about. Percy Jackson could have worked as another film attempt, as the book is only over 300 pages. While having more screen time can be great, trimming some of the fat from the book is possible thanks to the visual medium. But I could see they probably went with a no movies, only a show mindset to further deviate from the original adaptation attempt, which I guess is fair. After all, His Dark Material is a good comparison, as it is also a show adaptation from a first movie attempt, The Golden Compass, and the show is pretty well received. When it comes to The Lightning Thief's second attempt, there is stuff that holds it back from even a fundamental level, like poor pacing, poor direction, pretty pissed lighting. The action scenes could look very sloppy, how they would cut to black to skip over some of the powers being used. Some performances can get stiff at times, and just how bland and lifeless this magical world is in general. I could forgive all of that if the writing was stronger, but before I provide my examples, I also wanted to touch on the take that the show might not be for my demographic. I don't particularly like that card, as I do have some friends in my demographic who likes the show, but even then, there isn't any reason for a story that was meant for a younger audience, which means it can't be captivating for an older audience. There have been countless examples of stories told that have been experienced and passed down through future generations for how captivating those stories were. I started reading Percy Jackson in middle school after their publishing and after the first film dropped, and I can still reread it at 24. I reread it before the podcast and for this video, and I still have a good time with it. I think the best place to start with the writing problems is to start from the beginning.
It all started when I was born.
We open with direct lines from the book opening, which was also used as the first teaser of this show.
Look, I didn't want to be a half-blood. Being a half-blood is dangerous. It's
It's scary. Most of the time, it gets you killed in painful, nasty ways. If you think you might be one of us, my advice is turn away while you still can, because once you know what you are, they'll sense it too. And they'll come for you. Don't say I didn't warn you.
It makes sense to show the audience with a direct line from the book. It will give a sense that the show will be more accurate than the movie. We will review the importance of the opening lines and how they were missed later in this episode, so keep this in mind. But in isolation, I don't mind this intro leading into the title card drop. I will talk about how I don't need to see the rest of this expediting afterwards. Yes, some of the dialogue is straight from the book, but some things could be shown rather than telling the audience. This isn't the worst example for the show, but something like explaining Grover is his best friends is one of those.
Smash it.
I will talk more about these lines when we get to episodes 2 and 7, where my analysis will become more relevant to the discussion, so keep this in mind. We cut to the museum where Mr. Brunner explains Greek myths for the class. We briefly see Percy's dyslexia for the claps, and it won't play a factor for the rest of the show. I miss the interaction from the book where Mr. Brunner gets Percy to talk about how Kronos works. The movie had this in some capacity that the show didn't do, with Mr. Brunner getting Percy to talk about Perseus. You'd be surprised how often this will get mentioned in this video. The thing I did have an issue with the film version was that Percy was not listening to the lecture and being rude, as he was the one trying to pay attention, and he was trying to get Nancy to stop from being rude to Mr. Brunner in the book. There isn't any of that in the show, and everybody seemed to pay attention to Mr. Brunner, which is fine. After Mr. Brunner sends the kids off to write about the gods and how they make them feel, we are introduced to our first of many flashbacks with Sally and young Percy. There is an overall thing I would like to mention from this when I get more to say about Sally, so keep this in mind, as well as this line, which will be important for episode 3.
Is that why I named me after him? Because he was a hero?
What makes you think he was a hero?
Because he kills monsters.
What makes you think that she was a monster?
The main purpose of this flashback will be something said at the end of this episode. We cut back to reality, which I did like connecting Percy's daydreaming to the present. It also has some of the little setups, like Nancy being a nonce to Percy, Mrs. Dodds blaming Percy for this, Mr. Brunner getting both of them off his case, and Mr. Brunner showing his faith in Percy as a small dynamic burst of energy like these characters were in the book, although we're given this.
You'll be needing this. Hang on to that. It is a mighty instrument.
Percy broke his pencil earlier, meaning he would need a new writing utensil, and Mr. Brunner gives him a pen.
What could possibly go wrong?
If you don't know, that'd be a special kind of pen. You probably shouldn't hand a kid that kind of pen when he's needing a writing utensil to replace his broken pencil. Book Percy doesn't even learn he could use the special pen as a pen until the 4th book, The House of Hades, of the sequel series, The Heroes of Olympus. Well, it's good that he doesn't use the pen for his work as it's lunchtime. How convenient. Speaking of which, the next part will sound dramatic, but what's a content creator without drama? Don't answer that. These lines here.
There are all sorts of schools of thought about what drives that kind of bullying.
Look, I get that Nancy has issues. I'm just getting tired of her taking them out on me.
You could make an appointment to see Mr. Kane. He's really good
I
at
was
talking
thinking
to
more like shoving Nancy in the nearest dumpster.
Oh.
Told me that this Percy will not be like Book Percy, for the most part at least. I'm not going to talk about the lack of the real conversation Book Percy and Grover had about Percy getting frustrated that Mr. Brunner seems to have high expectations for him, which is strange why this isn't the thing they would talk about, as Nancy's teasing was much before at this point, but ignoring this, as it isn't my main issue. These are Percy's first real lines if we don't consider the opening exposition, Kid Percy talking to Sally, and when he gets out of the daydream saying, "Mom," and "me."
Look, I get that Nancy has issues. I'm just getting tired of her taking them out on me. I feel like maybe it's time to do something about it.
Percy indicates that this is going to probably be the first time he does something against a bully, as he suggests this as a maybe, Grover offering a peaceful idea like speaking to a counselor in passing as if this is what he would expect Percy to do. To Percy hesitantly suggest that he's going to push Nancy, and what seals that all of this is Percy's first impulsive behavior, Grover's.
Oh.
For a kid with something like ADHD, Percy is considerate enough to plan out his vengeance against Nancy. Grover's O tells me that this version of Percy wouldn't have done something like this before. The book lets us know that Percy is a troubled kid. The show has Percy say this as well. However, the examples that book Percy gave regarding being a troubled kid and how he was going from school to school are things like setting off a Revolutionary War cannon into the school bus or hitting a lever to send the whole class into a marine pool for an unplanned swim. These were accidents, but still acts of delinquency. Another action in the book is when Percy wants to fight Nancy for messing with Grover on the bus ride to the museum, but Grover has to keep Percy under control, otherwise he will get an in-school suspension. It showed that Percy gets in trouble quite a bit to get probation and a threat like in-school suspension. It also shows the friendship dynamic of Percy and Grover, that Percy would be willing to risk everything for his best friend, but Grover needs to keep his impulsive friend in check to prevent what he's going to regret down the line. There was a scene earlier during the monologue where Grover gets hit in the head with a bag, and then Percy starts getting up, but Grover indicates for him to stop. It could have been the start of showing that impulsive behavior, still due to the lack of focus or indication that Percy regularly does this, as well as Percy indicating that this scene was one of their first interactions with Grover in their friendship. It gets lost in translation. The book had Percy and Grover sitting next to each other on the bus while Nancy is pelting sandwich pieces at Grover, so when Percy tried to get up to defend him, Grover had to physically pull Percy back into his seat while reminding him of his probation. That hands-on dynamic nature versus the lunchroom scene having a whole table separating Grover and Percy makes the impulsivity of Percy less sporadic. This gets more apparent with the second episode, which we'll get to. The show has Grover tell Percy that losers like them shouldn't stand up to bullies. It's odd when he suggested,
You could make an appointment to see Mr. Kane?
and is now saying,
No, if there's one thing I know about bullies, it is that you should never, ever stand up to them.
I would say your first piece of advice is better than your second. Grover's last comment is his best one.
I know this place is hard for people like us. We're not going to be here forever. There are better places out there.
This would have worked better if Percy truly looked like he was going to beat Nancy's ass, and Grover needs to keep him in line. The lack of mention that Percy has probation or this is your last straw doesn't help him in terms of whether he really is a troubled kid or not. More on that later. Percy having low energy and planning on doing something bad makes it appear like he's a goody two-shoes trying to do something he knows is wrong. It doesn't come off as someone who means well but has an impulse. I'd say the show making a point of Percy and Grover focus on Nancy's bullying rather than Percy complaining about Mr. Brunner giving him a hard time has it feel more like a scripted thing when Percy complains about Nancy and Nancy comes with the half-eaten lunch and Percy goes Patrick on her. Rather than a discussion about Mr. Brunner's expectations, Nancy unexpectedly comes in to drop her sandwich in Grover's lap, and then Percy impulsively gets up to push it to the limit. Let's talk about that part. I've seen how others talk about how could Percy use the force to push Nancy into the fountain where there's supposed to be something of water that pulls her in. In the show's defense, the water from the nozzle pulls Nancy in, and it's difficult to see because it's very thin. I think this could have had a blackout since book Percy experienced that himself in the moment where he was so blinded by rage at what Nancy did that he blacked out, and all he could recall was Nancy was in the fountain and Percy was in trouble. I want to highlight this now because the show does include blackouts. The show goes about them as if they need to make a direct cut to black for those that have the commercial plan on Disney Plus, and not because Percy experiences them from time to time. After Nancy ends up in the fountain, Percy's pen vibrates as if it has a spider sense. This wasn't an attribute to the special pen in the book, so I'm not sure what the point of this was. This leads us to Mrs. Dodds.
We're not fools, Percy Jackson.
Mrs. Dodds? You okay?
So this was the next phase where I realized that the show would not have tension like the book did, at least most of the time. We'll get to that eventually. It wasn't obvious on first viewing because we didn't have all the episodes out at the time, but on rewatch, this does seem to sum up what will be true for the rest of the season. The only source of tension comes from the music and the vibrating pen, which doesn't exist in the book and only exists in the scene. That makes the moment artificial. I will be fair where there could have been some leeway as the mist, a veil that hides the magical world from the human world, can work in extreme cases like how it was handled in the show. Episode 4 had this shown in how humans perceive the Chimera as a chihuahua as an example. The people would not be able to see Mrs. Dodds going to her Electo form. This was shown to be the case when she was on the bus in episode 3 with mortals. However, what they would be seeing with Mrs. Dodds and Percy is a 65-year-old woman on top of a 12-year-old boy.
Certified lover boy, certified pedophiles. Wop, that fuck 'em up.
All of this ends with the special pen turning into a sword that stabs Electo in the gut and she fades to dust. They decided to chop down the tension of Mrs. Dodds taking Percy inside the museum, away from the class, away from Grover and Mr. Brunner, because they didn't feel like they had enough time for this. I will talk about this episode's pacing when we get to the end of it. I've seen people talk about how others seems to have a problem with the fight ending in a quick one motion, as the book had this be the case as well. Percy took one slash and Mrs. Dodds was gone. But that's being obtuse as to what people are criticizing. The fight isn't what people are referring to. It's the tension that preceded the fight that is missing. Things like in the book, as Mrs. Dodds moves into the museum, Percy notices that Grover is frantically looking between him and Mr. Brunner, who is occupied, foreshadowing their importance later, but also giving an impression that something is wrong with Mrs. Dodds and Percy being alone together. Other examples of Percy thinking he will have to buy Nancy a new shirt, but that's not it either, as the two continue to go deeper into the museum where they are completely alone. The uncertainty and isolated nature of this encounter with Mrs. Dodds asking questions about something Percy does not understand builds tension and intrigue in what is going on. Percy feels like Mrs. Dodds might hit him when he thinks she wouldn't. This seemingly normal situation of a teacher getting angry with a student builds up what is about to become a mystical conflict. I don't see how that sequence of events, that suspense before the encounter, would affect the pacing. We'll talk about what they decided to use their precious time for soon. The original film had this moment to a certain extent when Mrs. Dodds would take Percy to an isolated room to expose her Fury form to attack him. Now there are things that I don't like about this scene that are happening in the room right next to where the class is having their lecture, so they aren't isolated in this encounter. From her asking questions about the Thunderbolt to how Mr. Brunner and Grover had to be the ones to deal with Electo over Percy, and how Percy doesn't prove himself by fighting Electo as she flies away rather than him killing her. To be fair, neither adaptation has Mr. Brunner give the pen at the right moment before the fight when Percy is face to face with Electo. The show had Percy get it before the encounter when he needed a pen for his work, which is odd, and the film had Mr. Brunner give it after Electo flies off, which is also odd. Both defeats the purpose that Percy receives the sword in the proper moment against Electo, 1, to protect himself, 2, to show Mr. Brunner what Percy can be capable of, and 3, to make all of this weird to Percy when Mrs. Dodds and Mr. Brunner are gone. Percy is all alone with a ballpoint pen in his hand, wondering if anything that happened was real or not. The show has this to a degree, where Percy blacks out and finds himself surrounded by the class. He questions where Mrs. Dodds is, but Mr. Brunner tells him that no one in the school goes by this name. I will explain why that is once we get to that explanation, and this concludes the content of the first chapter. I would like to say up to this point, Grover and Mr. Brunner are strong, Mrs. Dodds is fine, but cutting out her gravitas and her tension was a bit lame, and Percy lacks that necessary edge that makes him who he was from the book, which could have been fine if not for how he described himself in the opening lines of the show. More on that towards the end of the episode. Now, both adaptations completely skip the second chapter of the book. 3 old ladies knit the sock of death. Someone might be saying that the old ladies were shown in episode 5, and that is correct, but I'm referring to what the rest of the content in that chapter was missing. The 2 moments that the show used were Percy getting expelled, and Mr. Brunner's word of wisdom's not having the right impact on Percy. We have our first cut to black that puts the boys in the headmaster's office determining the possibility of pushing Nancy into the fountain. Oh, hi Rick. I'll describe the book version of these events in a second. Percy continues to explain that he didn't push Nancy. The headmaster asked Grover to give his side of the story, and what praises I had for Grover starts to dissipate.
Percy had told me earlier in the day that he wanted to get back at Nancy for all she'd done to us. Grover? And he isn't being truthful about what happened at the fountain. Grover.
Are you saying you saw Mr. Jackson assault Miss Bobofit?
Yes, I did.
Why are you even here?
Yes, I know he explained why he did this later in this episode, but so much for that loyal best friend who would stick up for Percy. This moment is meant to represent the part where Grover is trying to tell Mrs. Dodds that he was the one who pushed Nancy, where she didn't believe him, but Percy appreciated the effort of his best friend trying to save his skin. Here, you can hear Percy's voice break as he cannot believe what his best friend is saying to the headmaster. Shout out to Walker. Grover has other strange moments to consider during the events of the show, but getting Percy expelled, even if it was his idea of protection, puts him in this negative light. The reason I bring this up is that Grover's explanation for this afterwards is meant to provide the necessary context for Percy, but ultimately it comes across as a way to streamline the next thing. And if I called out a problem I had with movie Grover doing something that Percy should have done, I'd have to put that energy with this as well. Grover playing a part in Percy's expulsion is a bad friend. Yes, Percy hates school, but newsflash, a lot of 12-year-olds hate school. Percy should be the one that get himself expelled without Grover's influence. This is why I felt like this being the reason they did it was strange. I get this was a factor that allowed the writers to streamline Percy getting expelled quickly so they can get to the next chapters for this episode. If we were to compare it to the book version of chapter 2, Percy gets to continue the school year. He doesn't mention what happened after pushing Nancy into the fountain as he starts talking about how he felt like he was going crazy when no one could recall a Mrs. Dodds, and that this teacher he's never met before, Mrs. Kerr, is treated like she was there the whole time. We can assume that he got his in-school suspension for pushing Nancy. Percy could tell that Grover knew what he was talking about as he was a bad liar. Percy would also describe nightmares of seeing Mrs. Dodds with her talons and leathery wings. Percy would get cranky and irritable. His grades would drop lower and lower. He'd get into more fights with Nancy. He'd get sent out into the hallway in almost every class. And the final straw that got him expelled was calling his English teacher an old sot. More acts of self-imposed delinquency that you miss with this show's version of Percy. Things that would have helped with the payoff as to why Percy is this way in the next episode, but due to the lack of emphasis on Percy's actions in this episode, it makes sense why there was a lack of impact on him when he learned the truth. We'll get to that. Due to this being close to the end of the school year, Percy was allowed to complete the term and his expulsion would be effective for the next school year. Ultimately, it isn't critical for the overall narrative, hence the streamline occurring, but it just adds to this show's version of Percy being passive when his best friend gets him expelled, rather than Percy playing an active part in it. The film has a better sense of streamlining as they don't bother with trying to use anything from chapter 2. Grover takes Percy straight home and explains to Sally what happened and how they need to go now. I'll expand on that in a bit. I can respect that more than attempting something and missing the key part of it when we discuss the bus ride scene with Grover and Percy towards the end of the chapter. We mentioned Mr. Brunner's attempt to say wise words to Percy, but not having the proper effect that he intended. A part that was skipped is when Percy tried to study for his final Latin exam, but he's struggling to the point where he decided to do what he's never tried before. Ask Mr. Brunner for help, as he didn't want to fail his exam without showing the effort that he tried. Before he can open the door, he hears Grover is having a conversation to Mr. Brunner about Percy as he listens in. Percy can't understand what they are discussing, with the kindly ones, the summer solstice deadline, Grover's fear of failing again, and how Percy might be in danger. Still, how he isn't ready to know about this, and the mist. But it gives the impression that they know each other from outside of Yancey Academy. It gave other mystical impressions of hearing clopping sounds, and Mr. Brunner seems taller than his wheelchair-bound figure in the window shadow. This conversation becomes particularly important for the bus scene coming up. Mr. Brunner's failed attempt at encouragement would happen in the classroom in front of everyone. He's using things like how it was best for Percy to leave Yancey as it wasn't the right place for him, and when Percy took that negatively, understandably, Mr. Brunner explained that it was best because he was not normal, which got Percy angry to the point of leaving while others laugh. The show version has a pretty good version of this, as Mr. Brunner has to use the context of what happened to Nancy as a part of his point for his spiel.
I've seen a lot of young people go through this sort of thing in my time. But of all of them, I suspect that you might have the most difficult journey. You are special, so much more so than you know.
Just stop. Okay, I don't need any more stories about how special I don't realize I am. They aren't helping.
Percy's response is fine, just a bit clunky with the line. I think book Percy's line, "Thanks, Thanks a lot, sir, for reminding me. Before Mr. Brunner says,
So much more so than you know.
would have a better impact on his feelings. This concludes the content of Chapter 2 that was used for the show, but as I mentioned, there was a bus scene in the book as well as the title, Three Ladies, to discuss. Grover and Percy were on the Greyhound bus heading back to Manhattan now that the school year was over. Percy noticed that Grover is nervously looking at everyone on the bus, which prompts him to ask about if he was looking for kindly ones. This shocks Grover, and Percy explains how he eavesdropped on Grover and Mr. Brunner's conversation. Grover tried to explain that he is just concerned about Percy's stress levels, but being his best friend, Percy tells Grover that he is a bad liar. Grover would give his business card and explain that he was trying to protect Percy. Before Grover could explain what he was talking about, the bus breaks down, causing everyone and the boys to step outside. Percy notices on the other side of the street that there was a fruit stand and 3 old ladies knitting socks the size of sweaters while looking at Percy. Before Percy can get Grover involved, he notices that Grover is mortified at this. Percy notices the middle one grabbed a large pair of scissors and cuts the thread that he could hear across 4 lanes of traffic. Grover got Percy to explain what he saw. Once Percy did, Grover was freaking out, saying things like how they never get past 6th grade, understandably freaking Percy out. Percy pieces together that these old ladies seem to be worse than Mrs. Dodds, how this might be a superstition to guess how snipping of a yarn means somebody is going to die, using the context clues of everything Grover was saying and acting. This was an underrated chapter to me, as I felt like there was a lot of elements here that gets paid off in the next 2 chapters that I will explain, as well as giving more characterization for the boys. Also that old-fashioned tension, which the show is allergic to, so I should have lowered my expectations. Due to the show having Grover being the one that sold Percy out to get him expelled, which I have a problem with, it makes sense why this entire sequence could not be used in the show. As I mentioned before, I know the 3 ladies were used in episode 5, and Grover does have his panicky moment in that scene, but the context as to what is going on there will be discussed when we get there. Up until this point, Percy is still lacking the edge, and Grover stitching on his best friend isn't cool. Now let's see if cutting 2 tension-filled moments and characterization for the boys so far was worth it as we get to the chapter 3 content. Grover unexpectedly loses his pants. Percy makes it back home, and this is a neat scene with Percy and Eddie. Classic way to let us know that whoever is in the presence of Smelly Gabe will have it worse than the other. If only that was true when we were introduced to Gabe. Percy's pathetic, unemployed loser stepdad, but not the abusive stepfather who plays poker with his friends. Isn't there a movie that got this right? I guess abusive stepdads aren't in Disney's MO, despite the history of wicked stepmothers, but whatever. Gabe takes more of an interest, condescendingly, in what happened to Percy at school compared to Book Gabe, who focuses more on the money Percy had in his pocket from his taxi fare, because ultimately he didn't give a shit about Percy until he needs to one-up him on his behavior. The apartment is also nice and tidy compared to the rundown nature in the book, where the place smells like Gabe's nasty cologne, cigars, and stale beers, with Percy's room littered with Gabe's old car magazines and muddy boots on the windowsill. We'll get to the significance of Gabe when it becomes more relevant, but we should talk about what really brought to this episode and the whole show down. Sally Jackson, who's out in the rain listening to Olivia Rodrigo's Logical for some reason. Fuck it. Let's analyze the meaning of the lyrics where this grown woman,
but now the current's stronger.
Poseidon, god of the sea, can create a strong current.
I couldn't get out if I tried, but you convinced me, baby.
Representative of what people insist is the best scene of the show, and perhaps an improvement over the original, I'm sure.
It was all in my mind.
Sally's a bird.
It really wasn't my fault. It really wasn't my fault. I'm all wet now.
Well, get back to you.
The conversation starts alright with a small nod to the blue candy. Percy has to tell his mom something that happened at school that seems too odd to explain, which gets her to say that he can talk about it at their Montauk cabin house. But before we can go there, let's get to that scene I've been holding on long enough.
On my way home on Sunday, I'm gonna stop at D'Angelo's and pick up sandwiches in time for tip-off. But if you make this miserable, I'm gonna go anyway, and then I'm gonna eat my sandwich and yours while I listen to the game on the radio.
You know I hate watching the Knicks alone.
So do I!
But make sure they put the hot peppers on my sandwich,
Not
please.
if you're gonna ask like that.
I said please. Please, could you have them put the peppers on my sandwich.
You got it.
You just couldn't help yourself, could ya, Uncle Rick? You said a lot of shit about the movie, but the fucking nerve, the fucking audacity, once again, and it's not the last time I say it, that the movie did this better. Shout out to Catherine Keener and Joe Pantoliano. Virginia Cole, the actress who plays Sally Jackson in the show, had a conversation with the Cosmopolitan about this scene, as this was her audition scene that got her the role.
Candidly, in my initial audition, we were only given the sides, and one of them was the scene where I was kind of having a back and forth with Gabe where I'm taking the car. I had context for what was going on because I didn't know the stories at all at that point. I played it very much in the way that you see in the final product. And Dan Schatz, one of our showrunners, told me that that was refreshing to see a Sally that didn't tremble because so many people had played it that way. And now, having read the books, I realized, oh wow, it was a very abusive relationship. Dan and Jonathan E. Steinberg and Rick Riordan made some adjustments.
This just explains so much. Not only Sally's portrayal, but also how others auditioned for the part of the scaredy cat. There's been this notion that Sally Jackson was a submissive Rick that would fold anytime Gabe said something to her, and I'm just baffled by this discourse. The show doesn't explain the blue food, which I get works as an Easter egg for book fans, but there was a way for Percy to naturally explain this to his unaware friends. The reason Percy and Sally ate a lot of blue food was because Sally and Gabe argued about blue food not being real. Ever since then, Sally would go out of her way to eat blue things, bake blue birthday cakes, mix blueberry smoothies, eat blue corn tortilla chips, drink blue cherry coke, you get the idea. She also chose to keep her maiden name Jackson instead of being called Mrs. Ugliano, and as Book Percy puts it, it was proof that she wasn't totally suckered by Gabe. She did have a rebellious streak, just like him. Then again, there is nothing to rebel against Gabe in this iteration since he's a loser. To explain how everyone, including the actresses that auditioned before Virginia, got this wrong, this is how Book Sally reacted in this scene. Not being scared or trembling, not talking Gabe down to the point where both characters seem toxic in this relationship instead of the one. In the book, Sally, after noticing that Percy is holding something sensitive that happened at school, cheers him up by saying that they're going to their Montauk cabin on the beach. Before Percy could appreciate this surprise, Gabe walked in demanding the bean dip. Percy had the feeling to punch Gabe, but his mother looked him in the eye for him to understand the deal that he needed to be nice to Gabe for a bit before they can go to Montauk. Sally's response was calm, explaining that she was on her way, just that she was talking about the trip with Percy. Gabe indicated that they've had this conversation before and thought she wasn't serious about it. Percy muttered that he knew Gabe wouldn't let them go. Sally tells her son, still calmly, that he needs to understand that his stepfather is just worried about money. Then she talks louder to make sure Gabe hears that she will not only make the bean dip, but the entire 7-layer dip for the whole weekend. Gabe softens at this and clarifies that the money for the trip has to come from her clothes budget, which Sally agrees to, and that she only has to take the car there and back, which she said they'll be careful. He also requests her to make the dip fast, and Percy apologizes for his poker game interruption, which Percy doesn't want to, but his mother's eyes warn him not to make Gabe mad, so Percy begrudgingly apologizes. Not at one point did I ever think Sally was weak, scared, quiet. She knew how to handle her son and her second husband to the point of wordless dialogue with her son. She was able to get what she wanted out of both of them, which benefited Percy and herself. Yes, Sally knows how to soften Gabe with what he wants, indicating that he has control in this relationship. Gabe doesn't hit her or attempt to show any sign of physical abuse to make this point, and I was never asking for this. Book Gabe in this moment is more like someone with main character syndrome in that sense, but Sally is using her womanly instinct to get what she wants out of him without having to yell at him or demand things out of him. If that's a sign of weakness, then hey, have at it. People talk about how this change works just because it's a Disney show and that the narrative of staying in an abusive relationship with your kid is not a good message. Well, sure, if you want to strip all the agency that Sally had in the matter, Percy isn't exactly a normal kid, and ultimately, Sally grows a lot from this book onwards, as we will talk about in the future. The fact that the commentary about this version of Gabe is if he is going to even deserve what happens to him at the end, with the majority saying no, speaks volumes. But maybe this is just an episode 1 problem. I'm sure they justify his fate at some point. At most, he comments about the car is his, he picks up Sally's phone, and he pretends that gambling is a job. He's just an insecure guy who tries to get his victories in because Sally is the big dog in this relationship. Show Gabe has 2 lines where you can actually feel a bit for him.
What are we doing, Percy? Every time. Wow. Wow. You know I hate watching the Knicks alone.
So do I!
Show Gabe appears to put in some effort with Percy, even with his response after Percy clarifies that he was expelled for fighting someone. He nods in somewhat of a bit of respect. And also, hey man, the Knicks were second in the Eastern Conference. Disney sure loves to bring them up. But on a serious note, Gabe and Sally seem to watch games together as his poker friends aren't in this show as they are in that one movie I can't seem to remember. Like any other relationship where arguments exist between the two, and if there is a problem, maybe just kick stones. Still, this isn't the worst thing about this episode. After the second cut to black, we have a dream sequence. Oh good, maybe we can finally see something visually interesting. The book had Percy's nightmare include 2 beautiful looking animals, a white horse and a golden eagle, fighting to the death while an ominous voice from below the earth is encouraging them to fight on. Percy tried to stop them, but cannot as the golden eagle is about to give the killing blow to the white horse as Percy wakes up. A great way of showing foreshadowing of what's coming, and you can have all these contrasting colors on the screen, maybe even animate the sequence.
Who are you? So weak, so scared, so sad. Run away, little hero, before you get hurt.
God fucking damn it. Boring ass looks of worried at a figure in the rain with generic villain lines. Can you utilize the budget that was more than season 1 of Game of Thrones, please? We'll talk about that more after covering all the episodes. In comes the beach house scene where Percy and Sally have a chat about what happened with Percy at school. The show, per usual, takes this in a different direction. Yes, both book and show versions of Sally have talked to Percy in front of a fireplace, but it's the content of what they're saying that's different. As Percy brings up what happened, Sally finishes his sentence knowing that he is talking about Mrs. Dodds. This gets Percy to question how she knows about her. This gets her to talk about Percy's father. She does a similar thing to the book where Sally talks about his features and personality traits.
And then I realized he was unlike any man I had ever met before because he wasn't a man at all. He was a god.
You fell in love with God? Like Jesus?
No. This line.
If you think you might be one of us, my advice is turn away while you still can. Because once you know what you are, they'll sense it too. And they'll come for you.
Had significance to it. It wasn't meant to sound like uber hero talk. Percy said this to the reader, as he should to the show viewer as well, that if you know you are a demigod like him, then the dangers, which we'll soon get to, will know too, and they will attack.
The stories that I have told you about Greek gods and heroes and monsters, they are real. In those stories, I have told you about how gods and mortals would sometimes have
Mom,
children
please
together,
stop.
children called
Mom.
demigods, and sometimes they are known as half-bloods.
Sally Jackson, you are putting your son in danger, and the threats that will be on its way will be entirely your fault. And I've seen people say that it's okay because Percy didn't understand what Sally was talking about. That makes it okay for Sally to risk the safety of her son because of this chance that he didn't understand what was said to him? That's just silly. Book Sally, the good mother, knew about the precautions of raising Percy. Their version of this conversation was more personal between mother and son. Percy asked if she was going to send him away to another boarding school, almost similar to a particular scene in episode 7 that I just can't wait to get to. And she indicates the difficulty of sending him away as she thought Yancey was far enough to be safe. Percy didn't understand what she meant, but his memories flooded in when he was in 3rd grade. A cyclops in a trench coat was watching him on the playground that disappeared once the teachers called the cops. And another time when he was in preschool, a snake slithered into his cot and his mother was horrified to see toddler Percy strangling a dead snake in his hands, inspired by the story of Hercules. Every school that Percy went to had something creepy that happened to little Percy, and that forced the family to move. Sally continues that people have told her that keeping Percy close was a mistake, and that she should have sent him to this summer camp, which didn't sound bad to Percy, but he could tell that if she sent him to this mysterious summer camp, that it might mean they never see each other again. It's important to note that at no point Mrs. Dodds or the Three Fates were mentioned by Percy, and Sally didn't prod that question out of him since she had no context, and Percy didn't want to frighten his mother and end their Montauk vacation. I'll talk about the demigod exposition more in the 2nd episode breakdown, as Book Sally was not the one to reveal this notion to Percy, because she was smarter than Show Sally by telling her son that would put him in danger. But you can really tell they wanted Sally to word vomit everything out. They tried to have Sally explain that the kid had to be a particular age where they could understand what was going on as the reasoning as to why this is okay. But when we get to Annabeth, it would explain why this version of Sally's logic is flawed.
You are a half-blood. Once they reach a certain age and they begin to understand what they are, terrible forces are drawn to them, driven to harm them before they can become strong enough to fight back.
Well, shut up then.
Some pieces of dialogue will be relevant for the 3rd act like before.
Hey, I'm not a god. There is something wrong with my brain. I understand that I'm weird. Believe me, I get it. I'm afraid something may be really broken.
This is where Grover comes in. Percy doesn't want to see him. I know why, but fuck that scene. Also this one. Grover comes in and it takes over 2 minutes of ad-libbing about how time for planning hasn't been consistent, how Grover has goat legs, and how Percy shouldn't panic with enough time that could fit a Disney sitcom laugh track. Weren't you being chased by something, you goat-legged ninny? Let me compare the movie version before discussing the end of the chapter, as the movie version was able to keep tension high. Since the movie decided to cut out chapter 2 and most of chapter 3, it kept the tension high. Percy is attacked by Mrs. Dodds. Grover takes Percy straight home to let Sally know that it's time for Percy to go, just where he hits Gabe with the crutches in a satisfying way, even if it's not book accurate. Then they drive straight for camp. No detours to the cabin. If they were to do that, then the tension would disappear completely. The purpose of the streamline was to get to 2 important moments of the book by the means of building tension of what is on its way. They even had time for some dialogue during the car ride that essentially talks about his dad. What's wild is that even in the movie, Sally does not reveal Percy is a demigod, as that was not the point of this conversation at all. In the book, after Percy wakes up in a startle from his nightmare, there is a loud knock and yelling outside. Grover was there, and instead of babbling like an idiot, he's angry. This is understandable, as given how Percy ditched him at the bus stop, which was understandable on Percy's side. But that's not what Grover was angry about. He says that he was searching all night and asked Percy what was he thinking. Sally looked in terror, but not because of Grover, more of why he was at their cabin, with rain and lightning being heard outside. Percy was shocked to see what he's looking at with Grover. Sally demands to ask Percy what happened at school that he didn't tell her about. Percy was still shocked at Grover's appearance. He could hear Grover curse in ancient Greek, which Percy realized he understood perfectly, due to being shocked at Grover's legs. This is the first time Sally used a tone he's never heard before to tell her what happened. Percy blurts out everything. The old ladies at the fruit stand and Mrs. Dodds. Sally looked deathly pale as she demands the boys to go to the car. Once he saw Grover run, things started to click about his best friend. The muscular disorder excuse that Grover had, but he can still run very fast because Grover's feet aren't feet. their cloven hooves. Back-to-back chapters ending with all this tension, so naturally the show will use none of that. Glad there's some consistency. By the way, ancient Greek is not explored at all in the show outside of the gods in that last episode. Surprise, surprise. Even the movie did something with it where Percy could read ancient Greek like English. One of the few positives Rick gave to the original. I've been talking about how the show did the streamlining wrong compared to the movie, and now that I broke down chapters 2 and 3 down, this is why. Mrs. Dodd's attack, Percy's expulsion, and the Montauk scene doesn't happen on the same day in the book. These events are spread throughout, with the field trip being in May, Percy getting expelled at some point, but enough time for him to finish this semester, and Montauk is in June once his classes are over before the summer solstice, an important day for another video. When it comes to streamlining and adaptation, it does make sense to condense the time frame, as it might look odd to have time skips here and there. However, these events are unique and have their context as to why they are important for the story. The show trying to make everything happen on the same day makes it more difficult to believe that there isn't any urgency with the likes of Grover and Sally. I know Montauk is in the book, as we broke down, but if there's this urgency going on, the show doesn't do that. It made sense for the movie to drop out Montauk, as it would have killed the urgency. Montauk doesn't have urgency in the book in that particular scene because Mrs. Dodds happened a few weeks ago, and Percy's trying not to scare his mother about the 3 old ladies. It allowed the time for characterizations between mother and son, and even Smelly Gabe. But once Grover shows up, all of the tension is back and swinging. The show wanted to do both ideas, but it doesn't work because it requires all of the stakes and tensions to pause to spew more exposition, which, by the way, even with all of this, it still isn't the worst example of this episode. Up until this point, Sally's not a good mother, Percy has a good exchange about himself that will be relevant soon, and Grover's wise words in his opening lines are now at the point where I expected him to be. Another quip machine.
Oh boy, she didn't tell you about... You didn't tell him about me? You're early.
If you think you might be one of us, my advice is turn away while you still can. Because once you know what you are, they'll sense it too. And they'll come for you.
You didn't tell him about me?
Why are you so stupid?
This leads us to the final chapter that episode 1 uses. My mother teaches me bullfighting. Grover continues to talk casually and explain things slowly about how he is a satyr and how he's protecting Percy. There was something missed here compared to the book. Percy doesn't question this notion that the best friend he was protecting from bullies is just saying that he's been protecting him this whole time. Best friends would question each other. They don't have to take everything at face value.
Why did Mr. Bruner ask you to watch me?
Because I'm your protector.
Wait, hold up. My protector? Are you kidding?
What? You think because I'm like this, I'm not capable of keeping you safe?
Now, you may have asked earlier why I kept saying all of this happened in one day. Maybe this took place over a few days, Red Devilosa. Well...
If I hadn't gotten you kicked out of school, you'd have never survived the night. With chasing us now, would have found you there easily.
I can't take this anymore.
Something is chasing you guys, and I don't feel that at all. What the fuck, man? Grover explains the miss to Percy in the meantime about what it is and how he didn't sense Mrs. Dodds as he should have. Grover did know Mrs. Dodds was Electo, but I could see this possibility occurring, so it's alright for now. He says everything will make sense once they get to camp, but Percy doesn't understand. The one thing Sally should have talked about in the Montauk cabin is the one she doesn't talk about in the show. It's okay because Grover, who's going to be the expo dump moving forward, explains it all. In the scene that has a danger chasing after them right now, and not when there was a quieter moment earlier in the cabin. I know these details are from the book, Rick, but when you sacrifice tension for exposition, it shows. We're almost at the worst part of the episode. Speaking of which...
Is that the Minotaur?
How can you see that far in the dark?
The Minotaur crashes the car and all of the characters are just silent, as if this is normal and as if crashing while in a car doesn't call for screaming. Let's take a break and talk about the book version. The trio are in the car and it's raining terribly out there as Sally drives with fear. Grover explains how he's been keeping tabs on Percy but assures him that he wasn't faking their friendship. He also explains that he is a satyr after Percy incorrectly assumed his legs were from a donkey.
Grover! What? Grover, why is there half a goat in your pants?
Whoa! You're half donkey?
I'm half goat.
Come on, Rick, this is crazy. Grover explains that the satyrs are real, just like the old ladies at the fruit stand and Mrs. Dodds. Percy still doesn't know who he is at this point, while the Minotaur continues to chase after them. Percy asks where they're going. Sally says they are going to that summer camp because he was in danger. Grover explains that the old ladies were the Fates, and them cutting a thread in front of the person means that he or someone close to them is going to die. Before Percy can process this information, lightning strikes as Sally swerves into the ditch and narrowly avoids it. Grover was slumped over with blood trickling down the side. He was unconscious as Percy and Sally had to pull him out of the car. I know, all the tension and anticipation on what happened next is coming in, but I have to go back to the one with none of that first. As you can see, Grover isn't unconscious, still blabbering exposition like a one-trick donkey. Now this part made me legitimately angry.
Grover, I am entrusting you to protect my son, my only child.
Don't worry, Mrs. Jackson. Percy will be totally safe again.
Swear it. Keep him safe from anyone or anything that comes for him that wants to do harm, that looks at him the wrong way. Do you understand me?
I swear.
This part will be clear when I get to episodes 2 and 3, but yes, this is not what Sally does in the book because Book Grover was unconscious at this point. And now we have got to the worst part of the episode. I kid you not. They put nearly 3.5 minutes for the Minotaur to just fuck off after crashing the car to show back up on screen for the final action scene. And what was this time used for? Sally explains how Percy should be brave, how he is singular, and how he is her miracle child.
I'm afraid something may be really broken.
You are not broken.
Hold fast, Perseus. Brave the storm that was made to break us, for we are unbreakable as long as we have each other.
Hold fast. Brave the storm.
We need to add clunky dialogue in the middle of an action scene so that the TikTokers can cut up versions of the lines being reused again since fuck context, and call this unequivocally cinema. Sally tries to do a Toro with the Minotaur, but he's just not having it. So he picks her up and turns her to gold dust. This is just one of those scenarios where giving more to say rather than showing through action dilutes the emotion or substance you want to give to these characters. The show was more focused on making Sally a supermom in this one episode, and that's not going to be the last time I talk about it. In the book, Percy gets Sally to help him carry Grover's unconscious body, despite how she insists that the monster's only after him and not them, so he should run to the pine tree for his protection. This is where Percy sees the Minotaur clearly. Sally tells him not to say the name as they have powers, something that the show doesn't use this rule at all. Sally coaches Percy to understand that if the Minotaur charges, move to the sides as he won't be able to change directions well. Percy asks how Sally knows all about this. She says that she's been worried about an attack for a long time, and she was selfish for keeping him near her. The Minotaur is on their trail, which forces Percy to separate from Sally and Grover. The Minotaur goes after Sally as she is unable to cross the camp barrier. She tried to sidestep like she taught Percy, but the Minotaur was ready for that trick, which had him grab her, and she dissolved in a golden light. Gone. In the end, Sally's actions spoke louder than anything she had to say. We're catching up to the last minute of the episode. Percy hears a vibration, and it turns out he's got the special pen. Wait, why does he have the pen? In the movie, Mr. Brunner made it clear that he'll need the pen for protection, since the movie made it clear they were not going to do the gaslighting with this version of Percy. Since the show wanted to implement the gaslight, why would Mr. Brunner let Percy keep the pen? Why didn't Percy just attempt to open the sword again when Mr. Brunner said he didn't know a Mrs. Dodds at the school? Also, I guess the pen sword makes a lightsaber sound when it opens, and it vibrates in the presence of monsters. That's going to be inconsistent moving forward, given how this is not in the book and how it should find any monsters moving forward, killing the tension, something the show likes to do anyway. In the book, Percy has to fight the Minotaur with his bare hands, so maybe they thought it would look silly if he didn't have a weapon on hand. I mean, I guess there could be some truth to that. If Percy didn't look like an idiot with the sword, he's using it to cut at the horns instead of the big body he could aim for after learning how simple it was when that worked on Mrs. Dodds. With a lot of shaky cam, Percy gets on the back of the Minotaur, rips the horn off the Minotaur, and uses it to stab the beast into dust. I remember all of that from the book. Yes, Percy actually ripped the horn from the Minotaur compared to how the movie had it where the Minotaur broke its horn on a tree itself that Percy pulled out afterwards. I will give the show that. But Sally didn't need to go on a long-witted tirade on how much she loved Percy to kill all the tension. The last part of the chapter that was missing is that after killing the Minotaur, Percy wanted to lie down and cry, but he had to go back to Grover. His head was split open by the Minotaur throwing him onto a rock. He wasn't going to let Grover go, despite crying for his mother. The boys were surrounded by campers. A girl thinks that Percy is the one, but a familiar voice tells the girl to quiet down, as Percy needs help before he blacks out. Thus concludes the end of the chapter and the episode. The actual Minotaur fight minus the sword that was done in the show was decent. I'd say it's the best moment in the episode with how simple it is. The biggest issue in this episode is the pacing, but I'm not one of those who thinks that the 30-minute episode is the problem. I'm fine with that. My problem is how much time is wasted on things that don't matter. Changes that ultimately affect the characters and who they are. Things are happening because they happen in the book, and not so much that these things flow in a natural order. These problems get worse as the show continues. 20 minutes of the movie covers the contents of this episode, and yet in that time, more was getting done. Characters felt like characters and not cardboard cutouts, book accurate or not. And even on that point, those 20 minutes had more book accurate concepts, or at least felt like the book in places. There are times when the show wants to achieve certain milestones, but they can't seem to get why it happened originally. This is where some of the moments that weren't utilized from chapter 2 plays a factor in the sequence of events. Book Percy choosing to ditch Grover because he was freaking him out with the whole "they never make it past 6th grade" talk is what had him go home, which resulted in the Minotaur's encounter. If the Fates didn't appear, then Grover wouldn't have freaked out, which means Percy wouldn't have ditched him, leading to Grover taking Percy home and possibly having Sally take them directly to the camp with no issue. The gaslighting was important in the book, as the opening line stated.
If you think you might be one of us, my advice is turn away while you still can. Because once you know what you are, they'll sense it too. And they'll come for you.
That is why throughout the first 4 chapters, Mr. Brunner and Grover deny any existence of Mrs. Dodds. Sally told Percy for all of these years that his dad was lost at sea, making him think that he was too good for his dad to even want to see him. Sally uses code words to reference what she wants to say to Percy so that he can get what she's saying without opening the mythological world to him. All of this to keep Percy safe. But when it comes to the show, yes, it is one of those scenarios that doesn't really matter for the overall story. But there's a payoff to these little moments that means a lot for characters over the plot at times. Grover admits there being a Mrs. Dodds, which gets Percy to exclaim that Grover has finally admitted it, and Grover explains that this is because if Percy knew less, the fewer monsters would attract. The gaslighting was small, but it had a payoff in the end. Another thing is that this goes back to Percy having little to no agency in the matter. He's not the one that gets himself expelled. It was his snake of a friend. He's not the reason why he's learning more about Greek myths existing in this world that brings the Minotaur towards them. It was his bad mother not keeping her fat mouth shut. Yes, these things were happening in the book and in the show, but the context of Percy not being the reason why these things are happening is the problem. The show desensitized the flaws because it seems like any kid character these days aren't allowed to have flaws or insecurities. I haven't forgotten what you did to Artemis fucking Fowl, Disney. With a kid who lacks his sass and spunk, a best friend who won't shut up about exposition, and a mom who's being rewritten to be a caricature supermom, it's gonna be a long season. Maybe Annabeth will be better. Episode 1 isn't the worst episode of the bunch, but it's going to be a long quest to get through this. I can't thank you, dear viewers, enough for supporting my channel and helping my quest into reaching 1K subs. I intended for this video to have my complete thoughts on the show, but I just had so much to say about every episode that I thought it would do more justice to separate these thoughts. I am hoping from the summer solstice to the winter solstice, I will complete my breakdown of the season to stay on theme with this series. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Peace.